Gunshots were fired near the main security screening area of the Washington Hilton on the evening of April 25, 2026, during one of the most heavily attended political dinners of the year, and the ripple effects landed directly inside the UFC's most ambitious event in the organization's entire history. The suspected shooter had traveled from Los Angeles to Chicago and then from Chicago to Washington, carrying a shotgun, a handgun, and multiple knives inside a black bag, according to hotel surveillance footage reviewed by senior law enforcement officials. He used an interior stairwell to bypass the most heavily monitored areas of the building and exited onto the same level as the foyer leading to the dinner's red carpet, where over 2,600 people were seated eating inside. A Secret Service officer was struck and was wearing a ballistic vest and survived. The president was surrounded by armed agents within 10 seconds of the shots, and at least one cabinet official was evacuated before the situation was contained. The UFC's chief executive was sitting directly in front of the head table where the president was seated, refused commands to get down, and described the entire experience afterward with the kind of language that cannot be repeated on a family channel. Just hours before any of that happened, that same executive had been interviewed on the red carpet of that same event, talking directly to camera about a UFC card scheduled on the south lawn of the White House in 7 weeks.
The concept was born from a rally in Iowa in the summer of 2025, when the president asked a crowd whether they watched UFC, mentioned the organization's CEO by name, and announced that a championship fight would take place on the grounds of the White House as part of America's 250th anniversary celebration. The UFC's chief executive confirmed on social media weeks later that plans had been finalized following a meeting at the White House, and from that moment, the ambition of the production became genuinely staggering to anyone paying attention to the logistics. Organizers planned a temporary stadium on the White House grounds with a capacity of around 4,500 people, with additional viewing screens set up nearby to accommodate up to 85,000 fans watching from public areas in the surrounding city. The estimated budget sat at around $60 million, multiple times the cost of any previous UFC production, with weigh-ins planned at the Lincoln Memorial and fighters scheduled to walk from the Oval Office directly to the Octagon on fight night. A regulatory crisis emerged before a single punch was thrown because the District of Columbia Combat Sports Commission announced that results from this event would not count on fighters' official professional records, which required emergency intervention from the national governing body to resolve. The event had been designated a heightened federal security classification. Security concerns had already been raised publicly by the sport's most prominent broadcaster months before the shooting. And then the shooting happened, and every single one of those concerns became impossible to dismiss.
Joe Rogan raised the alarm in December 2025, 5 months before the card was even announced. Asked on his podcast what kind of security situation fighters would be walking into, and pointed out the mental toll that kind of environment would place on athletes preparing to compete at the highest level. His concerns were not abstract, they were specific, delivered with the kind of blunt force that comes from decades of understanding what fighters actually need to perform, and how easily external pressure can compromise the mental edge that separates champions from challengers. In March 2026, he went further, brought up the ongoing U.S. military conflict with Iran on air, noted that holding a massive, high-profile event where everyone is gathered in one place at one time during an active war creates a specific kind of vulnerability that no security protocol fully eliminates. He trailed off before finishing that sentence and let the silence communicate what the words were struggling to contain. And the people listening to that podcast understood exactly what he was not saying out loud. The Department of Homeland Security had issued a bulletin to law enforcement partners around the country, warning about the threat of lone actors and noting that escalating military tensions could motivate domestic extremists to target locations perceived as connected to the government or military. The man who showed up at the Washington Hilton with a shotgun, a manifesto, and a stated intention to target administration officials arrived 7 weeks before thousands of fighters, fans, military personnel, and political figures were scheduled to gather on the south lawn of the White House. Lost inside all of that noise are two fighters who have to actually step into an octagon and compete for the undisputed lightweight championship of the world on June 14th, and both of them have been preparing as if the event is happening exactly as scheduled. The champion is 17-0, has knocked out 3 former champions in 3 consecutive fights using boxing that is widely regarded as the most technically refined striking in the entire UFC roster, and relocated his training camp to Miami to simulate the heat and humidity he will face on fight night. New sparring footage went viral, showing him moving with the kind of lightness and precision that fighters display when they are genuinely in the best shape of their careers, with one training partner apparently asking him to ease up on the power during later sessions. His prediction for the fight is a first-round finish. His reasoning is that his opponent's style of standing and engaging will play directly into the kind of combination sequences that have already ended 3 elite careers, and he has stated that he cannot wait to headline what he called one of the biggest events in sports history. The champion is the absolute favorite, with odds that reflect not just his record, but the manner in which he has won, the names he has beaten, and the fact that nobody in the lightweight division has yet demonstrated a reliable method of surviving his hands for more than a round. Even inside those favorable numbers, he has been careful to avoid the trap of treating this fight as a formality, acknowledging openly that the challenger is a dangerous man with deep experience and the kind of forward pressure that creates problems for everyone it has ever been aimed at.
The challenger is 37 years old, has fought for the undisputed title twice before and come up short against 2 of the greatest fighters the division has ever produced, and arrived at this opportunity by winning an interim belt in January against a highly regarded opponent in a performance that was convincing enough to earn him the main event slot. He carries 15 performance bonuses across 15 UFC appearances, which is not a trend or a coincidence or a reflection of opponent quality. It is a mathematical guarantee that every single time this man enters the octagon, something violent and memorable happens before the final horn. He was not originally the intended opponent for this fight. The champion had selected a different fighter from a different weight class as his preferred challenge. Injury intervened, and the challenger was elevated to the position he had been patiently building toward since winning the interim title. He learned about being selected for the main event while sitting cage-side watching an announcement at a UFC event, which is the kind of origin story that fits perfectly with a career that has been defined by showing up, staying ready, and stepping forward when the opportunity arrives, regardless of circumstance. He has stated that the spectacle of the venue will not alter his approach, that distractions of this scale do not enter his preparation, and that his job on the night is identical to every other night he has walked into a cage, regardless of who is watching or what is happening outside the building. A former boxing world champion has offered to join his training camp and provide guidance on how to approach a fighter with the champion's specific technical profile, which suggests that inside his team the opponent is being taken with extreme seriousness, even if the public line remains focused and calm.
The security framework surrounding the event has been designated at the level typically reserved for events like the Super Bowl. And yet that same designation falls one classification below the absolute highest level the federal government can assign, a distinction that became harder to ignore after April 25th. The president addressed the nation directly after being evacuated from the dinner shooting and stated that the country would not cancel events, would not allow anyone to take over its society, and that the dinner would happen again, framing the response as a refusal to yield to intimidation of any kind. That posture from the White House toward a dinner that was attacked applies with equal or greater force to a $60 million UFC event planned for the president's own birthday on his own lawn, which makes a voluntary cancellation or relocation essentially impossible to imagine from a political standpoint. The UFC's chief executive has described himself as even more energized about the White House event following the shooting, has not signaled any intention to move or alter the production, and has maintained publicly that the show is proceeding exactly as planned on June 14th. 3 separate security incidents involving the president have occurred across 2 terms in office, and the response to each has been the same: heightened security, public reassurance, and a continuation of the schedule, establishing a pattern that suggests the WHCD shooting will follow an identical trajectory. The question of whether fighters should be asked to compete under these conditions is real and legitimate, and being discussed openly inside the sport. But as of right now, the answer coming from every official source is that June 14th is happening. Neither fighter has publicly refused to compete at the White House. Neither camp has issued statements expressing reservations, and both continue to post training footage and conduct interviews with the energy of athletes locked into a preparation cycle that is running exactly on schedule. The private conversations happening inside those camps between fighters, managers, coaches, and family members are not accessible to anyone outside, and whether those conversations include concerns that have not yet surfaced publicly is something only those inner circles know. What the public record shows is a champion in Miami sparring with ferocity, making predictions with precision, and declaring the upcoming fight a historic opportunity that he intends to seize, with no visible hesitation in anything he has said or done since the shooting. What the public record also shows is a challenger who has spent 18 years walking into situations that most people would find overwhelming and treating them as tasks to be completed, a psychological profile that makes the spectacle of the White House lawn a significantly smaller variable than it might be for a less experienced competitor. A leaked audio clip from a private call between the UFC's leadership and the champion's management team included a reference to a specific security threshold that could force the entire card back to Las Vegas if it is not met, which means the possibility of relocation has not been completely removed from the table behind closed doors. The conversation about what this event represents, what it requires, and what it asks of the fighters stepping into it is not finished, and the coming weeks will determine whether the show that was supposed to be the most ambitious in UFC history arrives at June 14th intact or becomes something entirely different.
Every concern that was raised before April 25th is still present and has been amplified. The DHS threat bulletins are still active. The conflict with Iran has not been resolved. The regulatory complications required emergency intervention to fix. And now a man with a manifesto has demonstrated exactly what a motivated individual can do inside a secured perimeter in Washington. The gap between the Super Bowl level security classification and the absolute highest federal designation is not a bureaucratic footnote. It is a practical difference in resources, personnel, and protocols that the people responsible for keeping thousands of people safe on the South Lawn are actively managing. The event's proximity to the president's 80th birthday means that it carries symbolic weight that makes relocation politically undesirable in a way that few other events in UFC history have experienced, locking the production into a location and a date that serve purposes beyond sports entertainment. An outdoor venue in Washington in June introduces variables that controlled arena environments eliminate entirely: heat and humidity affecting fighter performance, weather unpredictability creating conditions that cannot be replicated in training, and a crowd energy shaped by the surrounding political atmosphere rather than pure sporting passion. The fighters who have been asked to compete in this environment have done everything professional athletes are supposed to do. They have trained, they have prepared, they have spoken publicly with confidence and focus, and they have declined to allow the external noise to penetrate the process that gets a fighter ready to perform. Whether that preparation is enough, whether the security is sufficient, whether the event arrives at June 14th as planned or gets moved, altered, or reconsidered in the next 7 weeks is a question that every person watching this sport is currently asking and nobody has definitively answered.
The most decorated combat sports executive in the world sat through actual gunfire in the same city 7 weeks before his organization's biggest event and emerged from that experience describing it as something unforgettable rather than something that changed his calculus about what comes next. That reaction is either the most reliable indicator that the event will proceed exactly as planned, or the most revealing window into a decision-making process that prioritizes ambition over every variable that has been accumulating since the day the president first floated this idea at an Iowa rally. A $60 million production, a 72-hour security window requiring federal coordination at the highest available civilian level, 2 fighters at the peak of their careers competing for an undisputed championship, and a president who has staked his cultural legacy on MMA being represented on the most iconic lawn in American political history. All of that was already true before a man arrived at the Washington Hilton with a shotgun and a stated intention to cause maximum damage at an event attended by the same administration that will be sitting cage-side on June 14th, and now it carries a weight that the original announcement could not have anticipated. The fighters will walk from the Oval Office to the Octagon if the event proceeds as planned, past the desk where executive orders are signed, through corridors that will be protected by layers of security that did not prevent what happened at the Hilton, and into an octagon sitting on the most politically charged patch of grass in the Western Hemisphere. That walkout, if it happens, will be the most surreal entrance in combat sports history for reasons that go far beyond the venue, and every person watching will carry the knowledge of what happened 7 weeks earlier into a night that was always going to be unlike anything the sport had ever produced.
Right now, both fighters are preparing. The UFC has not moved, the president has said nothing gets canceled, and June 14th is approaching faster than the questions surrounding it are being answered. The champion carries an undefeated record, a reputation as the most technically gifted striker in the lightweight division, and the kind of psychological confidence that comes from having walked into the biggest moments of his career and performed beyond expectation every single time. The challenger carries 15 performance bonuses, 2 near misses at Undisputed Glory, and an approach to combat that treats incoming damage as information rather than discouragement, a fighting philosophy that has made him simultaneously one of the most beloved and most difficult fighters to watch at the highest level. The fight itself, stripped of every surrounding circumstance, stripped of the White House and the shooting and the security debates and the political symbolism, is a genuinely compelling matchup between a technically superior champion and a relentlessly dangerous challenger who has spent his entire career defying the projections of people who underestimated his durability. The circumstances refuse to be stripped away. They are load-bearing elements of the story now, and anyone who watches this event on June 14th will be watching something shaped by everything that has happened in the 7 weeks preceding it, whether they want to acknowledge that or not. One thing is certain, and it is the one thing that has remained constant through every complication, every warning, every regulatory crisis, every security briefing, and every gunshot. Both men are preparing to fight, and right now, all signs point to the fights going on.